All right, we're close enough. Couple things. Hopefully you read my announcement. Did you get the president's address? The email? Yep, so that's going to be campus-wide. I don't know how clear your faculty or your professors made it. There is a lot of leeway. We were told at the beginning of the year that if you have an in-person class, then you do not need to go virtual. You don't need to do hybrid. Actually, you couldn't do hybrid. They weren't asking us to record lectures. Like last year, it was like you have to record your lecture. They said you don't have to record the lecture. That's changed now, so I was already doing that. I was already live streaming it, so it was recorded. For us, probably nothing's going to change. I will encourage you, if you want to participate in the live stream, please do so. Please do so. We've had 80, mid to upper 80s. 88 is what it was. 88 cases on campus. Last year, the entire year, from August 1st through the end of July, we had 330 cases total on campus. We're at 88. So pay attention to that. Be safe. How much do these work? I think we're going to probably find out, because now you have some school districts that require them, some school districts do not. And we're not talking about a district in Texas versus district in New York. There are places, same counties, where one school mandates it, the other school doesn't. And that's actually a really good comparison now, because you're getting whatever's happening in that county is affecting both schools. So high transmission rates, low transmission rates. So we'll see how much of an effect it does have. But please try to stay socially distanced. If you're not feeling good, fill out the wellness app, participate virtually. Don't come in because you feel like you have to come in. All right, we have attendance that we can cover just through online. So last week I was taking attendance, and we're still going to do that. I'm just not going to call out the names because that chews up almost 5 minutes of our class time. Instead, what should have gone live, is an attendance quiz. All right, don't click on it yet. Don't click on it. It's only live during the class period. It closes at 8:55. Once you start it, you have 3 minutes to complete it. It's a single question, all right? And it's going to be something I give the answer during the class. All right? I will tell you the answer. All right? If I happen to forget, ask me at the end of class so you can complete it. But sometime during the lecture, maybe at a stopping point, I'll say, okay, let's do this. I'll give the answer. I'll give you a few minutes to pull out your phone, do the Blackboard quiz, get it done and over with. It's a single question. I can tell you this question asks what movies did I watch, or what movie did I watch on Sunday, yesterday. All right? I watched 2 of them, actually. So, it's something that has nothing to do. You're not going to get it from watching the lecture, but once you take this quiz, that's going to serve as your mark that you've been here, you were here, you participated. And it's more than just signing on YouTube to watch, which we have 19 viewers. Some of you may be having it now. But you're going to be there actually listening, and if you have questions, you can then ask. All right, so I'm going to try to do this. Hopefully it speeds up the time, and sometimes the questions will be just, I might ask, okay, what 5-digit number did I state? And I could say, all right, the answer to the quiz is 10,354. And the question would be, what number was given in class? Something like that. Something where it's going to be hard for you to guess. All right, so we'll get to that a little bit later. Lab this week, we're meeting in lab, so the labs are still in person. It's kind of what it was last year. If you're not feeling good, complete the wellness app, start the process to get the accommodation, because we'll get notice from the student services saying, hey, they're in quarantine or students in isolation, please make accommodations. This lab isn't terribly difficult. Hopefully you've looked through it. It's something you could do on your own and have the homework completed for our next lab. There are some labs where it's hard to make up because we're out collecting data. On those, we'll come up with something else that you can make up if you're missing class with that official accommodation. But today, you'll spend some time outside, 10 minutes maybe, 15 minutes, and then we'll come back to the lab and work. We are using the computer, so you can use the computers there. If you have a laptop and prefer to work on your own laptop or tablet, you can do that as well. All right, any questions? Yes? Oh, good question. No, I'll take the highest. So yeah, the quiz from the introductory presentation, that's live. It stays open through the end of the night today. Yep. Yeah, so all my, with the exception of the attendance quizzes, all my quizzes will stay open until 11:30. All right, that's the due date. All right, you need to complete it. You've got 3 attempts. I'll take the highest grade. And I'll tell you, if you started at, let's say, 11:29, it will be marked as late, but I will manually go in there and see that you started it by 11:30, and that won't count as being a late grade. All right, if you happen to miss it, or if you know, we have a couple athletes here, you're out, and because you're traveling, you don't know if you have internet, come talk to me. We can always extend the deadline for you. Same thing, if something happens with work or you're not feeling good, please contact me. I'm willing to work with you. All right, so evolution, that's where we're moving. Why deal with evolution? This is ecology, right? Well, Dobzhansky, basically summarized it. It said, nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. And this is super true for ecology. Because ecology deals with interactions. Interactions cause selection pressures. Selection pressures cause evolutionary adaptation. We have to understand all of that in order to explain the interactions that are out there, in order to explain why species live in the area where they do, why their population sizes is what we see, why they fluctuate the way they do. So we're going to spend some time talking about evolution, evolutionary principles, adaptation. Some of this may be repeat material. You may have seen it before. Whoops, hold on. What happened? So, yeah, skip slide number 1. That was an accident. All right. Hold on. I got a message from a student. Wrong class. I thought somebody was messaging through the YouTube saying maybe sound doesn't work. Sound should be working good. All right. So yeah, this could be all repeat. If you've had evolution, you've probably seen it. And actually, I know you've covered some of this in the intro classes. So we'll kind of move a little bit quickly through this part. All right, so Charles Darwin is given the credit for developing this idea of natural selection, or evolution, some of the evolutionary theory. All right. He based some of the things that he determined off of Charles Lyell's book, Principles of Geology. So when Darwin was traveling on the Beagle, all right, it's a long ride, long ship ride, so a lot of nothing to do, and presumably he was seasick, so he spent a lot of time in his bunk reading this book. And from this book, he learned about the principle of uniformitarianism. This principle states that the processes that are happening today also occurred in the past at the same rate. Right? Processes that are occurring today have occurred in the past at the same rate. And that was an important idea from geology because it means if we look and see erosion happening in a stream, all right, you can safely assume then that erosion happened 20 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago. And those processes then would help shape and structure the communities that we would see today, the habitats that we would see today. Now, Darwin looked at this and said, okay, it can't just be about geological principles. It should also apply to biological communities and individual organisms. So from this, he starts thinking, okay, we know that we can select certain traits in organisms. We can select for those certain traits in organisms, and over time, we can ensure that offspring maintain that trait. He knew that was happening. And he said, well, if I can do that, if we can do that today, surely the same thing was happening in the past, and maybe that is why we see some of the adaptations that we see. All right? So he came up with his idea of natural selection, and it followed a very basic formula. And there's three points to this formula. One, he said that we have to have heritable variation. We have to have heritable variation. And this is really kind of important because he's stressing that there's going to be some sort of genetic underpinning. He didn't know what DNA was. He had no idea. He didn't know the process of mitosis and meiosis and why it was important. But he knew that you have to have this variation, and the variation has to be heritable. So if we select a trait in an offspring, their offspring and their offspring's offspring can also retain that same trait. All right, so we have to have heritable variation. If we don't have heritable variation, none of this can work. Point number 2, the second part of his formula. He says that resources are limiting, that nothing is going to be infinite. There's going to be resources that are in a limited supply, and thus all of the organisms that are out there will be competing for those same limiting resources. And he concluded that those individuals that are best able to acquire those limiting resources are going to leave more offspring. By getting those resources, they're going to have more internal energy that they can then devote to reproductive output. So either number of reproductive events, clutch sizes, so number of offspring, or even quality of offspring. All right? So heritable variation exists in our population. Resources are limiting. And then, because of these 2 points, if a trait develops in a population that confers an advantage to individuals at getting these limited resources, then they will, on average, generate more offspring than all of the individuals that lack that adaptation. And that adaptation then will slowly become fixed in our population. So heritable variation, we have limiting resources. Because of these 2 things, individuals with adaptations that allow them to get those limiting resources better are going to leave more offspring, and that adaptation will then start to increase in frequency. This is the idea of natural selection. That formed the basis of it. So what is natural selection? Natural selection is the differential representation of genotypes in future generations resulting from heritable differences among them in survival and reproduction. Get some time to get that down. So natural selection is the differential representation of genotypes in future generations resulting from heritable differences among them in survival and reproduction. So differential representation. It means you have some people leaving more of their offspring. They're getting more of their genetic copy into the next generation than others. That's differential representation. All right? And it's caused the heritable differences. So we tied it to a genetic basis. Those traits get passed down through generations. And the differences are caused by variation in survival and reproduction. So I could say survival or reproduction, but survival and reproduction, I think, captures it a little bit better. The better able you are to survive, the more likely you are to reproduce, right? So, survival is, or at least reproduction is, it's tied to survival. Survival is also partially tied to reproduction because, as we'll talk about, sometimes when you reproduce, you sacrifice energy that could have been used for survival, and thus when you reproduce, you increase your mortality rates. We'll talk about that later this semester. All right? So natural selection is all about differential representation due to genetic differences, heritable differences. In this part, we're going to introduce two terms. We're going to define two terms. One of them we've already defined, and that's adaptation. All right? So the adaptation, when we talk about adaptation, it's going to be a trait that increases an individual's fitness in a specific environment. What is fitness? All right? So the fitness, the same thing as like evolutionary fitness. It's just fitness is the ability of an individual to survive and reproduce relative to other individuals in the population. So what we're going to try to do is quantify the phenotypes of these individuals. We're going to try to quantify how well individuals do compared to others. And their success is determined by their traits, by their adaptations. In some cases, it's a single adaptation, and others, it's an entire suite of adaptations that contribute to that. Ready? If I switch it too quickly, please stop me. All right, so evolution. Evolution is defined as genetic change in a population of organisms over time. Yep. Thank you. No problem slowing down. If I didn't, we'd get through so much material that you'll feel completely overwhelmed. I'm not saying you won't feel overwhelmed when the exams come, but more so than you think. You get it? Oops. All right, so evolution is simply genetic change in a population. Genetic change over time. And it's kind of interesting. You hear people that say, I don't believe in evolution. And then you can kind of give examples. Hey, do you breed dogs? Oh, yeah, I'm a dog breeder. Yeah, that's evolution. Like, no, it's not. Because we have to get past that idea that evolution only applies to humans. Which reminds me. I meant to do this on Friday. Let me find the news. Here it is. Science in the news. Humans are evolving. Science finds evidence of an extra artery growing in our arm. Interesting. Crazy. That artery has a purpose. It provides blood supply towards developing hands. And once they develop, then that artery would just be reabsorbed. We'd lose it and we'd reabsorb it. And it seems like that reabsorption, less and less of it is actually happening. So it's in Journal of Anatomy. You can look it up. Just do human evolution arm artery or something like that. I'm sure you'll find it. So you talk about, they give some percentages. They looked at cadavers. I mean, we've got huge database, all med schools. But it was basically, this wasn't the article that I read, but it's something like historically, 1900s, maybe like 10% of the adults had that artery. So maintained it into adulthood, or actually maintained it past birth. Now we're up to like 30%, which, again, that's evolutionary change. It's evolutionary change. Unfortunately, that artery is tied to carpal tunnel. So, unfortunate. So maybe that carpal tunnel will be a selection pressure as we move to like computers doing everything. But anyways, yeah, we got sidetracked. I do like to do a science in the news when I see things that are interesting. I typically try to do it at the beginning of the class. All right, so evolution is just simply genetic change. We know it happens. We've demonstrated it. All right, we can demonstrate it. The evolutionary change that we're usually interested in is the genes, because the genes provide the variation. The variation that we have in populations originates from mutation. So mutation is the original origin of the variation that we see. Now you could stop me and say, well, hold on, what about recombination or sexual reproduction? I'd say, yeah, that produces evolutionary change, or that produces variation, but that variation had to start someplace, and that's mutation. So mutation is just random change in the DNA sequence. The proofreading failed. All right, didn't correct it. Accident where a gene snippet was cut and then reinserted. Maybe in the same place, maybe in a different place. All of that stuff, all the mutation, all of this random change provides the initial variation in our population on which natural selection can then act. Now, it's not just tied to natural selection. There's other processes that can cause evolutionary change. But what I want to stress is that natural selection actually acts at the level of the population. It's not at the individual. All right? It acts at the level of population. I can't go to Logan and induce a selection pressure on him and see change in him. All right? We can't go in there, take his hand, and slice it in half and then watch him sprout like new hands. That just doesn't work. That doesn't happen at the individual level. But if we go in here and say, okay, we're going to select individuals and say we're going to select all of the ones that have, let's say, brown hair, and everyone else is out. All right? And then we do that every generation, we see that change at the population. We don't see it at the individual. All right, so what's our population? We're going to define this one again, too. So a population is a group of conspecifics in a specific place at a particular time. A group of conspecifics is individuals of the same species. All right, so individuals of the same species, and for population, for ecology, it is very important to specify that we are in the same place at a particular time, because our individuals of the population have to be able to interact with each other. We've got striped skunks all throughout the United States. I would not call the United States skunk all of the striped skunks in the United States a single population, because the ones here in Texas probably aren't interacting with the ones in Indiana. All right, our population, all members, must have the possibility of interacting with each other. And in terms of evolution, this means that they have the possibility of randomly mating with each other. All right, if we're studying this evolutionary change at the population level, we can use the ideas of population genetics, the theories of population genetics, to do it. Population genetics is a field that analyzes the dynamics of genes in a population. All right, so it's interested in how they change, increases, decreases, or maybe even stay the same. All right, so it's another field. I don't think we have a population geneticist here, but we're going to use ideas from population genetics in this section. Now, these geneticists actually refer to a gene pool. That's their focus. The gene pool is all of the alleles in our population. That's what they focus on. All right, so in many ways, they kind of lose track of the individual and instead focus on the alleles and say, okay, these are the alleles that we're doing, or that we're studying. This is how it increases. This is how it decreases. And there's a lot more definitions out there. We have a Hardy-Weinberg lab that we're going to do. We're going to actually practice doing the Hardy-Weinberg equations. That comes up in 2 weeks because we don't have lab next week. All right, so that lab's already, I think it may be posted. I'm actually revising it, so if it's not, we'll get it up a little later this week so you have additional terms. But I believe all of the terms you should have seen in a prior class. All right. So this Hardy-Weinberg equation, it's a mathematical model. And what it's doing is it's modeling the changes in our gene pool. It's going to model our changes in the gene pool. And then that, by extension, tells us changes in our population. This Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is a mathematical representation of our genotype frequencies in a population in which the allele and genotype frequencies are not changing. So it's representing a population that is not evolving. And all that it really is it's describing probability theory. It's using probability theory to make these predictions. So since they're assuming, they make an assumption that a population is not changing, which means going in there and grabbing alleles out of our populations is entirely random. So if it's entirely random, then we can make predictions and compare those predictions to our actual observations. So if a population is not evolving, we know that allele and genotype frequencies are not going to be changing. If we make that assumption that they're not evolving, then we can compare our observed frequencies, what we actually see in our population, to those that would be predicted from a Hardy-Weinberg equation. If they match, great, our population's not evolving. But if there is a difference, then we can say, okay, this population's evolving. And that leads to the next step. Why? What's causing that evolution? We're going to do this in the lab. We're going to introduce the equations. I'm going to walk through an example. You're going to do a practice problem. We're going to walk through that practice problems. You have plenty of time in the lab. I switched it to lab because I think that's a great time. Smaller class sizes, more one-on-one if you have questions, you're not understanding how I got some numbers. So it should work out pretty good. All right, so what we're going to do is we make this assumption populations are not evolving. We calculate predicted frequencies if our population is not evolving. And if those match our observed frequencies, then we know, yeah, our population is not evolving. If they're different, we know evolution is occurring. So we're going to do this. You ready? Let me see what's the next. All right. We good? How does it work when we say a population is not evolving? Well, it falls under the assumptions of Hardy-Weinberg. Hardy-Weinberg assumes 4 different things. You may have seen 5 different things, and we'll address that. Number 1, we assume that our population is large. The larger the population, the less random chance is going to have, the less chance randomness has at drastically affecting our numbers. So we assume that the population is large. We assume that there's no migration happening. All right, so this is, we don't have any individuals introducing new alleles into our population. We don't have individuals taking alleles out of our population. We assume that mutation is not occurring. Because again, mutation introduces new alleles. We don't want that. We make that assumption. And then our last assumption, our fourth assumption, is that we don't have differential mortality or reproduction. No differential mortality or reproduction. And that means that everyone has the same chance of dying. Everyone has the same chance of reproducing. All right? And this is where sometimes this one is broken out into two different assumptions, where it would say no natural selection and random mating. But this statement, no differential mortality or reproduction, captures both of those sentiments. All right, so if all of this is true, if all of our assumptions are met, then our observed will match the predicted frequencies, and we would conclude that our population is in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, meaning we don't have any evolution happening. No evolution. So if it's in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, there's no evolution. None of these are violated. Now, what's rather interesting is that a population in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium will remain in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium if all of our assumptions are met. So as long as all of these four assumptions are met, our population will remain in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Our population will not evolve. The implication of that, then, is if we violate one of these assumptions, then we'll start causing evolution. And each of these assumptions, when it's violated, causes a different mechanism of evolution. All right? And we're going to talk about those mechanisms of evolution. All right, so, oops, wrong one. Leave this up. All right, attendance time. I watched 2 movies last. Well, I think watch is a loose term. What's that? This one? Oh, this one? Yep. I watched 2. I watched Battlefield Earth. I actually turned it on. I dozed off a few times. I've seen that movie a lot. Hadn't seen it in a while. It's at John Travolta. Worth it. Then the one that kind of surprised me was the Guy Ritchie movie, The Wrath of Man. Interesting. Interesting. What's that? Right? I mean, I've enjoyed several of Guy Ritchie's movies. Yep, Jason Statham. Yeah, those were good. Those are the 2 movies that I watched. Thought about watching Army of the Dead. I haven't seen that one yet. What's that? Yep. Those are the 2 answers to the quiz. Wrath of Man and Battlefield Earth. That was an older movie. 2000? Yes. Did you click it? Yep. That's what I said. Don't click it. I mean, why would you click it? I said you have 3 minutes to complete this. Let's see here. All right. Grade Center. Oh, hold on. Okay, Carlos. What's your last name? Is that right? Oh, we'll start. What's your name? Raylene Deanna. All right. You should be good to redo it. Colby Castro. Colby. Is that Carlos? Colby Castro. Colby. Colby Castro. All right, you are cleared. Go ahead and redo it. Anybody else? Foster? Is that right? Josh Foster. Yep. Save and exit. We got it? What is this? Uh-oh. All right. So we got it, right? It's good. Yeah, I could see everyone here, so that's going to count as attendance. I know you're here. All right, mechanisms of evolution. All right, so genetic drift. We've got 4 mechanisms of evolution that we'll talk about. All right, and we'll tie them to those assumptions of Hardy-Weinberg. So that first assumption that our population is large, if we violate that, then what we'll see is genetic drift. Now, genetic drift is defined as stochastic shifts in our allele frequencies. Stochastic meaning random shifts in our allele frequencies. This is going to happen no matter what. All right? Just random chance is going to affect our populations. When we're a really large population, the effect of this is going to be really, really small, really minimal. All right? It starts to be magnified as our populations get smaller and smaller and smaller. So, example, we have a population of 1,000 individuals. All right? 10 individuals have a specific gene, a specific trait, specific adaptation. I said 1,000, right? 10 out of 1,000. So we're dealing with 1% of this population. If we change, if random chance just happens to kill off one of them, it gives us 9 individuals. All right, so we went from 1% down to 0.9%. All right, not a huge change. But if we had 100 individuals in our population, 100 individuals in our population, and we had 10 individuals with this adaptation, now we're dealing with 10% of our population has this adaptation. If we lose one individual just through random chance, randomly kills them off, it reduces us down to 9. We go from 10% to 9%. We go a solid 1% change. That's very different than a 0.1% change. So, larger populations are less susceptible to genetic drift. It's really the smaller populations that are most important. All right? So, these small populations, chance events are more likely to affect their allele frequencies. And the other part of this is that when we deal with a small population, you're probably not going to be exhibiting random mating. And this would actually violate a different assumption. So small population sizes pose a problem of not only introducing genetic drift or making it much more significant, but it could also affect our random mating assumption. So one individual may actually mate many more times than another individual just because difficulty of finding a mate. We can quantify the effect of drift, or at least make a prediction about how significant drift will be by looking at the effective population size. And this is different from our population size. Because for us, when we're dealing with evolution, we're really only interested in studying those individuals that are mating. And that's what this effective population size captures. So effective population size, N sub E, is a subset of our total population that mates at random. It's participating in mating. As the difference between our actual population size and our effective population size increases, we're going to start seeing a larger and larger effective drift. If our population size and effective population size are similar, and as long as it's large, we're probably not going to see much effect, much effective drift. You ready for this? Now, there's consequences. Yeah, one more. Let me take care of this. Clear another attempt. There we go. All right. Clear the attempt. So, genetic drift could be represented in these graphs. All right, so these graphs are posted on the handout. All the figures are. And this just demonstrates two things. One is the randomness effect, genetic drift. Genetic drift is what causes the jaggedness. All right, so I made these are simulations. If I made it again, and I think I could, I have the files here, I could demonstrate. Every time we run it, we get a slightly different line. Just random nature. That's genetic drift. At a large population size, you can see that genetic drift has a minimal effect. We get the jaggedness, but the lines aren't drastically changing. The second component of this figure is to show the effect demonstrate effective population size. So you can see at an effective population size of 1,000, you do get changes, but it's gradual. As our effective population size decreases, you're getting much larger jumps, and you're increasing the likelihood that you're going to get to a situation where all individuals in our population have that trait, or none of them have that trait. So you have this process of fixation. Now this is a drastic thing, now, right here, where we fix a trait. Will genetic drift do this? Will it do it in this population? Yes, it would. Over time, genetic drift results in a loss of genetic diversity. That time component, how long it's going to take, really depends on that effective population size. So eventually, one allele will become fixed. It will become fixed. If we start at 50-50, 50% of our population, then it's a coin flip as to which one will become fixed. But if we start at where an allele is 80% in our population, yeah, we're going to be much more likely to fix that allele than if it was at 20%. So genetic drift is a mechanism of evolution. It's affected by our population size, by our effective population size. And the overall consequence of drift is a loss of genetic diversity. That's its total effect. Questions? All right. Assumption number 2 is migration. We assume that there is no migration in our population. When we violate this assumption, we see gene flow. So gene flow is the genetic mechanism. Gene flow is defined as the gain or loss of alleles due to movement. That's our gene flow. Now, if gene flow is going to affect our population, we have to have disproportional movement. Meaning we have to have either a net gain or a net loss. Or the other side is that our movement is random. or I should say, our movement is not random. I said if we're going to do this, we're not going to have the random movement. So the random movement means if we have, two different phenotypes here, all right, the chance that either of them will leave is the same. All right, that's our random movement. If we have disproportionate movement, then one of their traits may actually favor an individual to move, to migrate. And that takes alleles out of our population. That takes alleles out of our population. If we take alleles out of the population, what happens to our frequencies, to our allele frequencies, our genotype frequencies, and so forth? Well, they change. What's evolution? Change in these frequencies. So if it's random movement, then more than likely the number of genes that enter our population will probably be offset by the same number that leave our population. If that's the case, then we don't say we have gene flow. We know migration is happening, but we don't see the gene flow because the immigrants and the emigrants offset each other, or at least their alleles do. You've seen this one before too, right? Gene flow and drift. So this is an extreme case. You got population 2 where there's a lot more recessive alleles, the little a alleles. And then you have population 1 where most of the individuals are dominant. This is a case where we have 2 of these recessive alleles, these individuals with the recessive alleles, migrate to population 1. And what we've done is just added 4 more recessive alleles to our population. And if we count them up, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 total recessive alleles. With those 2 individuals, it bumps us up to 11. For this one, it's pretty big effect. That's gene flow. That's gene flow. Now, the effect of gene flow depends on direction. Depends on what's actually happening, the specifics of it. So it can oppose the forces of natural selection, or it could reinforce it. And it's the same thing with drift. It can oppose drift, or it can reinforce the effect of drift. So I think opposition's probably the best example, or the best way to understand it. If natural selection's trying to take out a gene, take out a trait, all right, natural selection's causing those individuals to die. And it would be good because you're slowly trying to move the population away from that trait. But gene flow could be introducing that trait repeatedly. So no matter how hard natural selection works, it can't wipe them out because you always have these new alleles coming in. So that's a case where gene flow opposes the forces of natural selection. And maybe it opposes it so much that we don't see the allele changes. To us, it looks like the population's not evolving when we know, in fact, yeah, it is. It's trying to evolve. It just can't. Gene flow is working against the forces of selection. Same thing could happen if we're trying to reinforce it. So if selection's trying to take out that trait, and then individuals with that trait say, man, this is not a good environment, I'm going to move and try to find a new habitat, we're just reinforcing it. Selection's already trying to take them out, but then the movement, those individuals move out of that population, further reducing our frequencies. So it can work both ways. And the same thing applies to drift. If random drift's trying to increase the frequency, but gene flow is taking it out, we're not necessarily seeing the effect. All right? So knowing that gene flow can oppose or reinforce selection, we could then conclude isolated populations, those populations that don't exhibit gene flow, are probably going to be more susceptible to natural selection. Or you can say natural selection will be more effective at evolving the best adaptations, or at least the better adaptations. All right? Because those isolated populations, they don't have gene flow. So if those populations have a trait that's good, natural selection is going to favor them and have a much easier time at doing so. This is an important concept. We'll talk about isolation and talk about movement between populations. So know that, yeah, once we get isolated, selection can become very important. Questions? All right, what we're going to do is we're going to stop it here, and we'll pick up with violating assumption number 3. And I'm almost done revising the Hardy-Weinberg lab handout. Once I get that posted, I hope to finish it this morning. Once I get it posted, I'll just send out an announcement so you can download it, and you'll have all the definitions. And it does cover some of the stuff that we're doing here. All right, so lab this week. If you didn't turn in your safety quiz, you better bring it. You can't participate in lab without it. All right. See some of you later today.